What's good, everyone? This is Shield back with part two of Oversimplified World War One. World War One. First off, if you haven't seen part one, go hit part one up real quick. But part one, let's just kind of review that real quick. Talked about kind of like what happened with Franz Ferdinand. Basically, what started the war between Serbia, Austria-Hungary, which led to alliances, basically with France and Russia. Then, of course, Belgium gets invaded, and then the UK jumps into it. So you have UK, Belgium, France, and Russia, and Serbia and Montenegro. And then you have the Ottoman Empire, technically in the future, right? You have Austria-Hungary, you have Germany. Eventually, you'll have the United States. Just so many people died in this war, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in the trench warfare system. Of course, the French and the Germans tried to one up each other in terms of getting around each other, going up to the northern French coast. Then, of course, trench warfare begins, no man's land begins. That goes all the way back down to Switzerland, and there's just tons of fighting and pelting each other with artillery. And so many people, pointless deaths in this. And for what, right? Territory, diplomacy, unknown. But let's jump into part two.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and
Most of this is the United Kingdom and French territories that you saw there in Africa. Let's go back. Let's look at those.
The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas.
So you have, of course, British, mostly British when you're talking about Canada, Australia. A lot of the territories or Commonwealth and colonies in Africa. No America in this. Yeah.
Dominions. And the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling war, though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number one, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea.
Germany had New Guinea? That's crazy, but good job, Australia.
The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans.
And that's, I mean, just based off my reaction there, New Guinea and then the African colonies, that's not talked about. That might be talked about once you get to like 4 or 5 chapters into the war, like if you were to study it. But like baseline knowledge, not really talked about. When you talk about World War One, you're like, yeah, that just happened in Europe. It just happened in Europe. No, it happened. The world was at war.
Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some
And it's crazy because how quickly this will switch in 20 years.
of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war. The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, whoops, looks like we're at war now. The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death.
That's just anytime you ever fight Russia, this is the elements is going to be probably we see this World War One, World War Two, Napoleon, continuously.
Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed. The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living with...
Isn't Gallipoli where Churchill had, wasn't he like a commander in that? Or like some sort of high-ranking officer leading one of those battles?
Within Ottoman territory. and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against.
I mean, my goodness, look at all these like factions at play here. I mean, whether it be Australia going that far down, the African colonies, the Japanese, Italian, the Ottoman Empire, to Afghanistan, the Suez Canal, just so much. I mean, like I said, when you ask, okay, where was World War One? Yeah, Germany, Russia, France, England, you know, right over there, Italy maybe. No, they're just all over the place.
The British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war. Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be.
This is where you're going to get mustard gas. This is where you're going to get things that begin the Geneva Convention.
Jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which
Welcome, America.
had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying U.S. opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that a lot of people can stray. I mean, there was atrocities on every, usually, just about in every war, there's atrocities on each side, usually.
After, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on. Together, they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list.
United States.
Tell me with the Allies behind the scenes.
Not yet?
And Germany didn't like that one bit. Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle. So they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged. So they didn't try that again.
That's crazy to think that there was, you know, only one naval battle in all of World War One.
The UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well.
Which is basically a draft, right?
Because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of
Verdun.
The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and
This is it.
brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day.
One day, 60,000 die. That must be gut-wrenching to hear that. Whether you're a British citizen, or imagine the Prime Minister, or the King at the time, like what their thoughts were. We just lost 60,000 in a day.
It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war, and then they got pounded. The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies.
And I think this king, or this line of family, eventually produced, well, he's already alive at this time, but Prince Philip, who marries Queen Elizabeth II, who has a son named Charles, who is currently king.
After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields.
Mesopotamia. Was it still called Mesopotamia? By the way, see my background? The green screen background, not my real background. That's Mesopotamia. Like this is so every time we hear Mesopotamia, gotta Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization.
And they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad.
So we're in Iraq.
The army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who
Which there's a famous movie because of this.
helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply lines. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of eating and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling
Rasputin.
shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd complete
And this is where the Russian Revolution begins.
with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war, and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it
Is it the Zimmerman telegraph?
be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. A second time further north, then again and
Belgium is basically, there is no part of Belgium at this point that is not under being occupied by the Germans.
again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to
And this is where World War II and Mustache Man begins to kind of like start crafting the revenge. The Treaty of Versailles, which will basically demilitarize Germany to a point to where their standing army is gone, the Rhineland is gone, their territory is shrunk significantly. Basically, a little bit, I think, about where the mountain borders are, and then let's see what else they give them. I don't know if they'll show them.
reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay
The guilt, and then of course the reparations. That's going to be the worst part of it. The reparations, which will bankrupt Germany, basically.
bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and
17 million dead.
millions dead, the world learnt its lesson and never had such an awful war again.
That's yeah,
For about 20 years.
for about 20 years. Wow. What do we learn? I think mainly we learned that did this war have to happen? I mean, I think of course we talked about it was inevitable, right? But in terms of like the bloodshed, just crazy. I mean, 17 million. 17 million today is not 17 million in 1917. But hold on, let's see what the population. Hold on, guys. Let's do some little math real quick. So let's do how many people were alive 1913. Let's do 1913. 1.8 billion people. Do the percentage 17 million of 1.8 billion. So like what is the percentage of people? So it's about a percent. It's about a percent. And so that would be like a percent today would be 80 million. That would be like 80 million people dying. That's more than most countries have. That's insane, bro. 1% of the population is gone in a couple years. 60,000 people, 100,000 people dying in a day. For what? For what? All for what, right? But let me know what you guys thought of this video. And if you guys have any videos that you recommend, feel free to let me know in the comments. But yeah, I appreciate you guys. Hit the subscribe button. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye bye.